Hi, this is Professor Megan Light, and I'm doing a brief presentation on World War I. World War I is referred to as the Great War. It ran from 1914 to 1918, and it's sort of ironically called the Great War, but it had a devastating impact on European society. It was one of the first wars to use modern technological warfare, and from the images you're seeing here, it included the use of machine guns, howitzers, wireless communication, aviation, so planes, trench warfare, the idea of trenching and having two sides compete against each other in that way, artillery, right, so firing from aviation or from airplanes, and then even the use of chemical weapons, which is what you're seeing in that bottom left photo with the mask that we're trying to protect people. The Great War itself led to physical and psychological damage to the soldiers coming back alive from the war at an unprecedented scale. People were entirely unprepared for the level of devastation that was seen and also how people were processing that. So things like PTSD were totally unheard of and the symptoms went completely unrecognized. The machines that were supposed to be created to make a more perfect world also made it possible to slaughter on an unprecedented scale. So people were just totally overwhelmed by the loss of limbs, the loss of eyes, the fragmentation of the soldiers. World War I brought together all of the world's economic powers with two opposing alliances. The first are the Allies, which consisted of Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States. They all did join at different times, but at the end of the war, those were all the powers that came together for the Allies. The Central Powers consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. By the time the war was over, the Allied powers had claimed victory. More than 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, had died. In World War I, Italy waited until 1915 to enter the war, again, eventually allying with the Triple Alliance against the Central Powers. But this is markedly different from when, in World War II, Italy was allied with the Axis powers of Germany and Japan against the Allies, which were England, France, Russia, and then later the US. So what was the trigger for the war? The trigger for the war was actually the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife of Austria, Sophie. They were shot by Yugoslav nationalists Gavrilo Princip of Sarajevo, Bosnia, on the 28th of June in 1914. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungary Empire, and Princip and other nationalists were struggling to end the Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia and Herzegovina. There was a lot of political instability in the area, which is the Balkans, particularly in Bosnia, Serbia, and Herzegovina. And those threatened to destroy the several European agreements among countries that were working together. But this incident set off a complete diplomatic crisis. This is an image of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie and their three children, Prince Ernest, Princess Sophie, and Maximilian, in 1910. So again, for the triggers for the war, Austria-Hungary, like many countries around the world, blamed the Serbian government for the attack, and they hoped to use the incident as justification for settling the question of Serbian nationalism once and for all. But because Russia had supported Serbia, Austria-Hungary waited to declare war until its leaders received assurance from German leader Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany would support their cause. Austro-Hungarian leaders feared that a Russian intervention would invoke Russia's ally France and possibly Great Britain as well, which obviously they were correct. And within weeks, the world powers were at war and conflict soon spread around the globe. So there are several videos that you might want to take a moment a little bit later to watch. This is the crash course in World War I, how the world began. This is a thorough overview of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, kind of those initial ideas about the Central versus Allied powers. The second one is another crash course world history video, number 210, that kind of talks about who specifically started World War I. So to continue, the war began in 1914 with that assassination of Franz Ferdinand. July 30th, Russia officially mobilized. August 2nd, France mobilized in support of Russia. August 3rd, Germany declared war against France. August 4th, the United Kingdom declared war against Germany. And on August 4th, the majority of other things really happened. All major powers are at war or in active status of war with one another. In particular, as Russia mobilized in support of Serbia, Germany invaded neutral Belgium and Luxembourg before moving towards France, which led the United Kingdom to declare war on Germany. After the German march on Paris was halted, what became known as the Western Front settled into a battle of attrition with a trench line that changed little until 1917. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army was successful against the Austro-Hungarians, but the Germans stopped its invasion of Eastern Prussia. In November of 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. This is what mostly made up Turkey, and opened fronts in the Caucasus and Mesopotamia and the Sinai Peninsula. In 1915, Italy joined the Allies and Bulgaria, joining the Central Powers, and Romania joined the Allies in 1916, as did the United States in 1917. So basically, just to give you sort of an overview and a map, this is a still from how World War I started. Again, another crash course video from World History 209. You can kind of see all of those blue Allied powers versus those really central kind of green German Empire, Austria-Hungarian Empire countries. So the Great War was promoted as something noble and great. It was called the War to End All Wars, and it was likened to be a battle for civilization itself. So this is a British recruitment poster from World War I. It's really talking about how participation in this war was really important, and you can see kind of a sinking ship in the background and soldiers drowning in the ocean behind it that says "Take up the sword of justice" as a noble cause. Photographic stills from the war show the use of all those new weapons I mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow. So we have different types of machine guns. We have men using trenches and trench warfare. We have this image of cannon fire, right? So sometimes you are seeing images like this on the left where a man's actually physically being blown back. Other men kind of huddling in a trench on the right-hand side. But again, we have the massive idea of death and destruction across Europe through the war and the catastrophic injuries that people encountered. So for the continuation of the war dialogue, the Russian government collapsed in March of 1917, and a revolution in November, followed by a further military defeat, brought the Russians to terms with the Central Powers via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which granted the Germans a significant victory. But after a stunning German offensive along the Western Front in the spring of 1918, the Allies actually rallied and drove back the Germans in a series of successful offensives. So then on November 4th, 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire agreed to an armistice, and Germany, which had its own trouble with revolutionaries, agreed to an armistice on the 11th of November in 1918, which ended the war in victory for the Allies. So by the end of the war, or soon after, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire actually ceased to exist. National borders were redrawn, with several independent nations restored or created, and Germany's colonies were parceled out among the victors. During the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, the year following the war, the Big Four, which were Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, actually imposed their terms in a series of treaties. The League of Nations was formed, which we'll still hear about today, with the aim of preventing any repetition of such a conflict. This effort ultimately failed, and economic depression, renewed nationalism, weakened successor states, and feelings of humiliation, particularly on Germany's part, eventually contributed to World War II. By the end of the war, nobody knew what it was for. Governments had lied to their people. By the end of the war, soldiers had seemed to have died for nothing, and depression really set in across Europe. This brief Piece in the middle of this slide is about the casualties that were encountered in the war. You can see in early 1914, 58,000, but by mid-1915, 500,000 had died. The Battle of Verdun in 1916, 510,000 had died. By the end of that German Spring Offensive in 1918, another 500,000 soldiers had died. So there was a massive amount of people who actually had perished and died through the war. For the totals, more than 70 million military personnel, including 60 million Europeans, had been mobilized in one of the largest wars in history. There were over 9 million combatants, and something like 7 million civilians had actually died as a result of the war, which is including the victims of a number of genocides. The casualty rate was exacerbated by the belligerence, technologies, and the industrial sophistication and the tactile stalemates that had caused this grueling trench warfare. Again, it was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, and it paved the way for major political changes, including revolutions in many of the nations involved. So how does this relate to our future movements? So we're going to be working on Dada and New Objectivity movements next. And the mass destruction and chaos seen in World War I actually really horrified many artists working in this early 20th century period. So World War I serves as a backdrop for several art movements, including Dada, New Objectivity, and then the Bauhaus. They were revolted by the brutality of the war. They found modern society to be responsible for it. And so Dada in particular reacted against these societal norms, the society that caused this war. New Objectivity actually focuses more on the state of the soldiers and their physical and emotional pain. So you'll see more works associated with what soldiers look like coming home for New Objectivity. In general, there's not so much a single identifiable style, than more of a frame of mind and an attitude in this interwar period, which is sometimes called Weimar Germany. So it's the war period of this 1918 leading up into the 1930s when World War II really starts to take place. So those are what we're going to focus on next.